Hello students, we're now going to cover the interrelated topics of ecology, ecosystems, and the environment. We will see that ecosystems are independent communities of living things, like us, that cycle or recycle matter while energy flows through the system. Let's begin by briefly defining these terms, and hopefully it'll become clearer as we go. The environment refers to both the abiotic, that is the non-living, and the biotic or living components of the environment, that which is around us. Ecology is a study of the relationship of a community of organisms, of living things, and this environment. And the ecosystem is a sort of a localized community of biotic organisms, living things, in conjunction with the non-living components of the environment. Now, these seems like I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but as we go, I hope that it'll be clear what these three terms refer to. Let's look at this diagram, which shows the ecological levels of organization. And let's consider ourselves to be the deer in the bottom left-hand corner. Hopefully, you're dear to someone. That is, you are the individual organism, the deer. And as you go out, your circle extends to your peeps, to other deer, a population of deer in this environment. The community then refers to all of those organisms, both you and those like you, deer, and other organisms, such as the bobcat and the beaver and the rabbits, who live in this environment. When we say ecosystem, we refer to not only those living things, you, the other deer, the bobcats, the beavers, the jackrabbits, but also the abiotic components, that is the streams, the soil, but also the climate, that is the temperature, the weather that make up this local environment. We'll use these terms several times, but we also may refer to a biome. A biome is a larger region that shares some commonality in both the organisms that live in that region and the climate. And then the largest term of all is the biosphere, which we refer to this blue marble that we're living on, planet Earth. So hopefully this diagram helps explain some of these terms. To give you another example of these levels of organization, consider the individual organism. Instead of you being a deer, let's consider that you're a daisy. So a daisy might be the basic organism, the basic living unit, which has more than one cell, but it's the basic unit. You might then have a population of these daisies, of these organisms, of the same species as shown in the picture. And these daisies might live among other species, other types of flowers, other types of vegetation. That would be what we call a community. So the individual organism, which could be you, the population of those organisms of your type, your species, and the community, which includes other types of organisms, other types of species. A little more about levels of organization and some of the characteristics that we're going to be talking about. An ecosystem refers again to a community of living organisms interacting with one another and with the abiotic factors of the environment, such as the rainfall, the water systems, the climate, the average temperature, the soil, etc. We will stress a couple of important aspects of an ecosystem. That is, there is a flow of energy and a cycling of matter. And then back to our definition that ecology is a study of the interdependence of the community of living organisms and their abiotic environment in one of these ecosystems, one of these local areas. Biomes. Remember, a biome is a larger area that shares some of the same type of species and climate. And here are a number of the biomes that the land masses on planet Earth are usually described as, and so that you get some idea what we mean when we say a biome. For example, polar ice caps, that would be a biome, or the tundra, or taiga, or mountain zones. We live in an area that is described as a temperate deciduous forests, deciduous meaning those trees that drop their leaves over the winter. And you can see other biomes such as deserts and savannas and chaparrals and rainforests. So that's what we mean by a biome. Now, these biomes can be quite varied. Why do they vary? Well, obviously it has to do with such things as the average temperature, the geological formations, the weather, etc. The plot on the right is an interesting one. It shows the relationship between the average annual temperature, the x-axis, and the average annual precipitation. And you see the various different biome categories. In the next slide, we'll stress some of these. The temperate decidual forests, the biome that most of us probably live in, is one that has an intermediate average temperature of maybe 10 to 20 degrees centigrade and an average annual rainfall. If there is much less rainfall, you would have what are called deserts, the subtropical deserts or the cold deserts or the temperate grasslands. As you can see, a desert can be either very low in its average annual temperature or very high. It really is determined by the low annual precipitation. And then we have tropical forest. A tropical forest can have a very high average temperature, and it differs from a desert by having a larger average annual precipitation. So whether or not the biome is a dry desert, whether it's hot or cold, or one of these lush rainforests, depends upon the combination of the average temperature and the rainfall. Now I want to give you 5 or 6 characteristics of ecosystems. 1. Every ecosystem consists of both non-living and living parts. The non-living meaning such as the average temperature, the amount of daily sunlight, the rainfall, the soil conditions, etc. That is the non-living components of an ecosystem. And then we have the living components, which could be all the flora and fauna and insects, all the plants and animals and microorganisms. A second characteristic of ecosystems is that energy flows through the ecosystem. Energy flows. And we will talk about the various living organisms in an ecosystem as either being producers of energy, or consumers, or decomposers. The producers of energy, which can be photosynthetic algae, or most commonly we think of these as plants, grass and trees, are those that carry out photosynthesis, that can obtain their energy directly from the sunlight. The consumers, the primary consumers, such things as insects and birds and our mouse here, consume the plants. They're herbivores or plant-eating organisms, and they obtain both their energy and the molecules that they need to build themselves from consuming these plants. So they are primary consumers. Then we have what we call secondary consumers. In this case, it's a rattlesnake. The rattlesnake which consumes the herbivore, consumes the mouse. So the secondary consumers obtain their energy by consuming a herbivore, a primary consumer, and not only the energy, but again, the building blocks, the molecules that they need to build themselves up. And at the very top, you have what we can call tertiary consumers, which are things like a hawk, which consumes the secondary consumer. So this is essentially a food chain showing the interrelationship between various organisms in an ecosystem. The third characteristic of ecosystems is that matter is cycled or recycled in an ecosystem. And here we will focus on the carbon cycle. And that's because all organic matter, and we are organic matter, is based on the chemistry of carbon. So let's first look at CO2 or carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. The carbon dioxide enters our atmosphere in a variety of ways. One way is the burning of fossil fuels. Here we have a wood or fossil fuel plant that's burning wood or petroleum or coal. Carbon dioxide also enters the atmosphere from soil microorganisms that are decomposing. These are the decomposers that are breaking down matter. and in releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Also, plants and animals, whether it's a herbivore or a carnivore, will undergo cellular respiration, releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide also can be taken up in a process called photosynthesis, what can be called fixing carbon, to form carbohydrates. The carbohydrates then become the building blocks of the plant itself, but also that plant is eaten by, here's an example of the plant that is eaten by this herbivore, this little bunny rabbit, which can then be consumed by the bobcat if he's not careful, or the secondary consumer. So this is the way that carbon is cycled through the system. If one way to look at this is that an individual carbon atom, if we could just tag and watch an individual carbon atom over a period of millions of years, that carbon atom might spend some time as carbon dioxide, it might spend some time as calcium carbonate, but also it would spend time as part of a plant or part of various animals, or me and you. And because the carbon is cycled, and not only carbon but other matter is cycled throughout the ecosystem. Another characteristic of ecosystems is that every organism that occupies an ecosystem has its niche. And this drawing shows an example of different birds which can coexist together in an ecosystem because they obtain the food that they eat in different places or in different ways, and their bodies have been adapted for that purpose. So that a flamingo, for example, having its long stilted legs and a long neck, can obtain its food differently than some of the smaller birds. Another characteristic is that ecosystems tend to be relatively stable. They achieve a balance in population of the different species, the producers, the herbivores, the carnivores, and that this balance can be fairly stable over a period of time. We might think of this as the population of various species within the ecosystem. But we also know that the ecosystems aren't permanent. They can change with time. Now, they can change over these very long periods of time, geological time, due to movement of plate tectonics, or even the changes in the Milankovitch cycle. If you remember what that is, the precessional cycle of the Earth, which we think can be an explanation for why there may be ice age periods of warming and cooling. But over shorter periods of time, 50, 100, couple hundred years, there can also be changes in local ecosystems. And the example shown here is a lake, which over a period of time, due to the buildup of sediment, it becomes actually filled in and is no longer a lake. Another characteristic of ecosystems is what is sometimes called the law of unintended consequences. That it's virtually impossible to change one aspect of an ecosystem without affecting the other parts of that ecosystem. Whether or not we're talking about changing the biotic, the living system components, or the abiotic, the non-living system components. An example of this that we may look at in class is the video on how introducing wolves into Yellowstone National Park actually altered the rivers, which you might think that doesn't even sound possible, but the video will give you an explanation of how scientists think that was a consequence of introducing wolves into that park. So the point is, this includes the impact that humans can have on the environment and ecosystems. What can be called the anthropogenic impact, or the impact of man on the environment. Now we'll stop at this point and we'll pick up with a discussion of these anthropogenic impacts of man on the environment. See you in a little bit.